Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's recorded program, Preserving Democracy After the 2024 Election, Reflections on the Current Moment and the Paths Ahead. I'm Lizzie Medvedow, Executive Director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy, and along with Dan Kenstrom, our Faculty Director, and Abby Chingo, our Administrative Assistant, and the many student organizations with which we're co-sponsoring today's program, we are delighted to introduce our second Rappaport Senior Fellow of the semester, Genevieve Nadeau, a beautiful name. Counsel and Impact Manager at the nonpartisan nonprofit organization, Protect Democracy. Right now, we're barraged with political rhetoric, ads, articles, and exhortations about the upcoming presidential election. Democracy, we are continually being told, is at stake. What does that mean? Winston Churchill famously stated, "It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Every day in the newspapers, we read about barriers to voting, challenges to election laws and practices, required safety training for poll workers, and potential legal battles over the election results. In Sunday's New York Times, an article noted that there are almost 90 lawsuits already filed across the country attacking the upcoming election. In Georgia earlier this month, the Georgia State Election Board ruled that all ballots must be counted by hand. Yesterday, according to the New York Times, a lawsuit was filed challenging that rule, which, and I quote, would invite chaos on election night, create delays in reporting results for large counties, and put the security of ballots at risk, unquote. If ballots are counted by hand, can you imagine how long it will take for the election results to be finalized? So, how do we ensure that our democracy, so precious to all of us, remains intact, regardless of the results of the election? That's what we're going to hear about in today's community address by Genevieve. Next week, Tuesday, October 8th, in here, 12 to 1:30, Genevieve will be moderating a program also addressing the upcoming election with three luminaries in election laws. Lee Chapman, the former acting Secretary of State in Pennsylvania, Ben Ginsberg, an uber prominent lawyer who has represented 4 of the past 6 Republican presidential candidates. He was national counsel in the Bush-Cheney elections, including the 2000 recount, and he's currently a CNN political commentator, as well as Professor Justin Levitt from Loyola Law School in California, whose scholarship focuses on the Constitution and the law of democracy. Justin Levitt in 2021 served as the White House's first senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights. Unfortunately, all 3 panelists will be presenting via Zoom due to the timing, but happily Genevieve will be here in person navigating the conversation and the Q&A. For that program next Tuesday, since we know lunch is critical, Blue Ribbon Barbecue will be the lunch fare. If you haven't already RSVP'd, please do so. Now I have the great pleasure of officially introducing Genevieve Nadeau. Some of you may have seen her here last year when she participated in a Rappaport Center and Career Service program talking about public sector jobs. I was so inspired by her work that I immediately knew I wanted to bring her back to the Rappaport Center for a deeper substantive conversation. As I shared, she's Counsel and Impact Manager of Protect Democracy. There she leads a team of lawyers, policy advocates, and other professional staff to develop litigation policy and communication strategies to defend the rule of law, guard against democratic decline, and secure accountability for abuses of power. She's also led the policy work of the National Task Force on Election Crises during the 2020 election, as well as working on the reform of the Electoral Count Act. In addition, Genevieve is a lecturer at Harvard Law School, where she periodically co-teaches the Democracy and the Rule of Law Clinic and related seminars. Before she went to Protect Democracy, she worked in the Massachusetts AG's office, where, among other leadership roles, she was chief of the Civil Rights Division. There, she oversaw a multitude of initiatives in litigation and fair housing, and employment, equal access to public accommodations, healthcare, education, and consumer protection. She's written a number of briefs at the U.S. Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court of the United States on issues addressing human trafficking, marriage equality, race-conscious college admissions, fair housing, pay equity, and military service by transgender service members. In addition, she took a lead role on behalf of the AG's office in securing the passage of an act to establish pay equity in 2016. Earlier in her career, she practiced labor and employment law in the private sector and served as an attorney advisor in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. She is a graduate of Stanford Law School and UMass Amherst. If you would like some time to meet privately with Genevieve today, Monday or Tuesday, she will be here all 3 days. You can sign up on that QR code on the table after the program. Please join me in welcoming Genevieve.
Great. Thank you. That was a very generous introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So I am very glad to be here, and it's such an interesting moment, I think, in our history in this country. I'm going to share some reflections on the current moment and the paths ahead. But I first want to say just a little bit about my own personal journey to this moment. I suspect at least some of you in this room, I've always been fascinated by concepts of self-government, right? How a group of people get together and decide the rules that are going to govern themselves and their communities and what values those choices represent. But until relatively recently, that was sort of an academic interest, I would say. As Lizzie just gave you my whole career, midway-ish in my career so far, after a few other stops, right, I joined the Attorney General's office. And I began working in the Civil Rights Division. And that for me was a fairly formative experience. I was able to see firsthand the ways in which we are still struggling as a nation to realize our ideals, even here in relatively liberal Massachusetts, on issues ranging from access to housing, to healthcare, to education and employment, and fundamental rights like the right to marry. But still, even throughout that work, I didn't really question the basic framework or the infrastructure of our democracy. So democracy for me continued to function sort of like the operating system, right, running in the background of your computer. Not perfect by any means, sometimes a little glitchy, but relatively reliable. To be sure, I think to some degree that reflects my own experience and my own privileges. I think it also reflects the time that I sort of came of age and began my career. Even as recently as late 2016 and early 2017, I was asked a question during a panel event. So this was right before or right after the 2016 election. And the question was about whether we at the time were facing the end of liberal democracy. I said no. And I cringe a little bit now at how dismissive I was at the thought of it. Because it wasn't much longer before it became, at least to me, pretty clear that the 45th presidency was a different kind of presidency than we'd seen in this country in a long time. Maybe just as concerning was how quickly the Overton window began to shift. And prominent politicians and policymakers began coalescing around a view of the presidency that seemed to center on power, really, as much as anything else. And so for me, that time period was really eye-opening. Right? It was like the infrastructure of our country, or that operating system of our democracy, suddenly becoming much more visible. It's one of the reasons that I ultimately joined Protect Democracy, where I now work. Protect Democracy is a nonpartisan organization Our mission is to prevent American democracy from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. Okay, so say that 5 times fast. We work with Democrats and Republicans in states and in the federal government and among partner organizations, and we have staff across the ideological spectrum, so both Democrats and Republicans on staff. In this job, which I've been at now for about 5.5 years, I've been able to do a really wide variety of interesting things. And it has combined in some ways some of what I loved about my work at the Attorney General's office, and then that part of my brain, like I said, that has really been interested in concepts of self-government. So I'll give you a few examples. So I've represented a pastor from New York who was targeted by the Department of Homeland Security, my former employer, for surveillance and travel restrictions because she ministered to migrants at the southern border. I also represented Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, that name might be familiar. Right? He was targeted with a really vicious campaign of intimidation and defamation by some of the country's most powerful people, including the president himself, because he reported what he believed to be wrongdoing by the president in connection with Ukraine and testified before Congress. Right now, my team is litigating against a county in Florida that is restricting books that some people don't think kids should read based on the viewpoints they express. And we're still pursuing accountability on behalf of police officers who were injured during the attack on the United States Capitol on January 6th, 2021. I don't just work on litigation though. In fact, quite a bit of my work is not litigation. In the lead up to the 2020 election, I did a lot of work around communications and policy, right? Working with the media and lawmakers to understand at that time what were some of the particular risks likely to come to pass during the election. And then, as Lucy said, I spent probably 2 years after that working to reform the Electoral Count Act, which until recently I think was a little known federal law that governs the casting and counting of electoral college votes. And now I spend the bulk of my time leading a team that is preparing to mitigate and defend against future authoritarian threats. So I continue to learn every day the extent to which American democracy, while full of potential, is maybe not quite the sure thing that I once thought it was. So now here we are, it's 2024. We are facing down another historic presidential election where Americans are in the position to make a conscious choice, should be anyway, about the future of our country. And I think at a time when our democracy is more vulnerable than it has been in quite a while. But how vulnerable are we? Well, democracy is not inevitable, right? To think so would take a relatively short view of history. And the United States has already enjoyed a relatively long period of democratic governance. And there's room for debate, though, on exactly how long ago we became a true democracy. I'm assuming everyone here knows what the words democracy or liberal democracy mean. But just to ground us, right? There are different analysts, different rankings use slightly different factors. But at its core, democracies hold free and fair elections in which different candidates and different political parties can actually compete, right? In democracies, the government is constrained by some form of checks and balances, usually both internal and external. Democracies are characterized by the rule of law, right, which means due process and equal application of the law, among other things. And democracies protect civil liberties, both for minority groups and for the sort of political opposition. So that includes free speech and association type rights. So by many measures, the United States is currently experiencing a relatively rapid period of decline. So you may have heard of an organization called Freedom House, right? It scores countries across the world it uses a 100-point scale that takes into account these and similar factors. It's called their freedom score. While the United States is still categorized by Freedom House as, quote, free, since 2010, our score has dropped from 94 out of 100 to 83 out of 100. So compare that with Canada, for example, which I think now has a score of 97, or the UK, which has a score of 91. And the trend here is actually consistent with trends across the globe. So the 1990s brought waves of democratization around the world. Then that stopped. In the last 15 years or so, the trend has been one of democratic backsliding around the world. Right. The world has far more autocracies than democracies. And there's data that show that 40% of people in the world live in countries that are becoming more autocratic and therefore less democratic. I think that includes us. And roughly 72% of the world's population now live in what are classified as electoral or closed autocracies. So, also worrying. This is the dark part of the presentation. Also worrying. We're seeing a real shift in people's attitudes about democracy. So while the majority of Americans still report that they support democracy and democratic principles, that's sort of trending downward. And really interesting, I think especially for this audience, is that that trend seems to be driven by younger Americans. So it's a worldwide survey asks the question, to what degree do you think it's essential to live in a democracy? Older Americans overwhelmingly say yes, to a large degree, it's absolutely essential. Younger Americans, not so much. And as little as a third say it's absolutely essential to live in a democracy. And it's not just that younger Americans take democracy for granted, as I have. They're open to alternatives. Right? So a generation ago, 1 in 16 Americans reported, again in a survey, that they were open to army or military rule. That number is now at about 1 in 5. So that's the end of the statistical portion of the afternoon. But I think these trends are troubling in their own right, but especially given that so much of American democracy is what I would call soft, right? So much is governed by norms. So these are unwritten rules that are difficult to enforce, at least in any sort of formal way, and they require and depend upon people to abide by them. So take, for example, the Department of Justice. Right? In the post-Nixon, post-Watergate era, it has been generally understood by both political parties that the president and the White House should not interfere with or direct specific investigations or prosecutions. Right? Never mind direct prosecutions against perceived political enemies. But that's not codified anywhere. Right? There are Department of Justice policies that reflect that to a degree, but it's not in the law. And so we've primarily relied on people of good faith, right, to enforce that norm, and that makes it vulnerable. So what people think about democracy and how committed they are to it, and the extent to which they're willing to hold accountable those who violate democracy's core tenets really matters. All right, so what's the alternative then, right? The alternative, authoritarianism, that some people seem to be more open to. So definitions vary somewhat, and I hear some use the term populism to refer to some similar traits. But it's basically a form of government where power resides in one person or a small number of people, that lacks checks and balances, and that is characterized by obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. I would say don't worry, though, so much about the precise definition or the precise terminology. It's more important that you recognize it when you see it. So I've seen different formulations again, but generally all get at the same thing in defining this thing called authoritarianism. So at Protect Democracy, we use a framework that consists of 7 common and interrelated tactics that we know from conversations with scholars and experts around the world are commonly used by authoritarians throughout history and across the globe. We call it the authoritarian playbook. So I'll walk through it relatively quickly. Autocrats corrupt elections. Right? In the 20th century and earlier, dictatorships often came into being at the barrel of a gun, let's say. When democracy went away, it went away entirely and was replaced with dictatorship. 21st century authoritarians, on the other hand, tend to maintain a facade of democracy by continuing to hold elections, right? But they sharply tilt the rules in their own favor and against their opponents, or even seek to overturn unfavorable results. And that's basically what the term sort of electoral autocracy refers to. All right, number 2. Autocrats politicize independent institutions. So democracies require that at least some core functions operate independent of partisan politics. Think about the Department of Justice and law enforcement, or things like central banking, right? Autocratic factions tend to capture these institutions and use them as shields or swords, right? Protect loyalists on the one hand, or retaliate against critics and rivals on the other. Number 3, autocrats aggrandize executive power. So that means expanding executive power in relation to the other branches of government, putting the autocrat and their allies above the law, and weakening or eliminating checks and balances. Number 4, autocrats spread disinformation. You can't have healthy debate and assess competing ideas, both of which are critical to a democracy, without some amount of shared facts, right? Or when people can't differentiate between relatively common spin versus coordinated lies or conspiracy theories. Number 5, autocrats quash dissent. So that's the sort of flip side of the coin of spreading propaganda, is quashing dissent, including censoring speech, and importantly, targeting a free media or the right to protest. Number 6, autocrats tend to stoke violence. Now, what I've mentioned before in terms of the tactics are really about the sort of regulatory or legal mechanisms by which the state wields power. But sometimes autocrats use brute force, either state-directed violence or incitement to private violence, which then creates circumstances in which the populace is more open to a strong government response and more willing to give up civil liberties. All right, number 7, last but not least, autocrats delegitimize already vulnerable or marginalized communities. This is probably the oldest tactic in the playbook. While sometimes it's about ideology, it's often really about dividing and conquering in order to consolidate power. Right? So autocrats use vilification campaigns and sow division to pit groups against one another. Right, so these 7 tactics in combination, that's how you recognize authoritarianism at play. And even though I'm going to use that term, authoritarianism and autocrat, today, I encourage us not to think of it, though, either authoritarianism or autocrats in absolute terms, right? Or in terms of polarities, like democracy and authoritarianism exist at the opposite ends of the light switch, right? Instead, think of it as a continuum or a sliding scale. I think when you think of it as just polarities, it's a little bit harder to recognize that way, and certainly harder to believe is happening. So nations can become more or less democratic, and likewise more or less autocratic. And the latter, the slide towards authoritarianism, can be dangerous and hard to reverse, even if it's not complete. So with that in mind, what if the American people elect or re-elect an aspiring autocrat to the White House this November? We hardly have to use our imaginations. We just have to remember the past, the recent past and the distant past, and take the promises now being made during the campaign, both seriously and literally. I'm not going to belabor this point. There's plenty out there that I recommend you should and could read to understand the stakes of the election. But I do want to remind you of a few direct quotes from one of the 2 major party candidates. I am your retribution. I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. The press is the, quote, enemy of the people. Immigrants are, quote, poisoning the blood of our country. And when it comes to perhaps the most important of American democracy norms, like peacefully accepting electoral defeat, only if it's a, quote, fair and legal and good election. So that's just some of what's being forecast. Sounds to me a lot like the authoritarian playbook, but you can assess for yourselves. I think an important question actually that I get sometimes, I read an argument I hear, right, is, when and if this happens, will the system hold, right? I hope it's right that the system will hold, but I don't think we can count on it. So first I'd go back to my point about democratic decline happening along a sliding scale. In my view, the potential for serious damage, the type that can be extraordinarily hard to reverse, is quite real. And I'm not particularly comforted by pointing out that we survived the last time around. So a few notes on that, why that is. The first Trump presidency, the 45th presidency, did a lot of damage to our country from a democracy perspective. And we should expect that the second time will be worse. But this is not just about one person, not just about one candidate. I think it's fair to say that we now have an authoritarian movement in this country. And that movement is better prepared than it was 8 or 4 years ago even. It has more of an ecosystem behind it, right? So that by ecosystem I mean there are lawmakers at the federal and state levels, as well as think tanks and other organizations, right? And that ecosystem understands the institutional guardrails that have existed in the past and how to work around them. We're also likely to see fewer political guardrails in practice, particularly in the executive and legislative branches. Fewer people willing to push back within their own political party. So there's a lot to say about the courts right now, and that should be maybe a whole other set of programs. But I think it's fair to say that trust in the courts is at a very low point right now. And at worst, the legal system is really failing to do its job to uphold it. It's also just been a tough many years, right? Fatigue and polarization are very high. So the bottom line for me at least is that we can't simply cross our fingers or assume that the system will hold, because it very well may not. Right, so this leads to the question of what's it going to take then to preserve our democracy under these circumstances. There are, I'm sure, many tactical answers to this question, right? Lawsuits you can bring, policies or legislation you can try to press, protests you can engage in. But I want to focus for a couple of minutes on how we might define success in this context. And I actually don't think it's clear that there's consensus on that. What does it mean to survive? But certainly mitigating the harm done and ensuring that we have meaningful elections in 2026, and especially 2028, has got to be a big part of the answer. So that is, of course, about ensuring the health of our elections themselves, the rules around casting and counting ballots, and making sure those rules are followed. But having a meaningful election in the future is going to require making sure there's meaningful competition, right? Including, for example, protecting debate and the exchange of ideas, including ideas that challenge those who are in power. So recall what I said earlier about electoral autocracies, right? If the outcome of the election is effectively predetermined, what you have is a democracy only in name. So for meaningful competition to be possible, and because authoritarian movements tend to focus more on weakening the resistance than they do on building support, we need to further build and maintain a broad and diverse pro-democracy coalition and protect civic space. So by pro-democracy coalition, I mean a broad coalition of people and organizations who might disagree on many things, on policy, on politics, but agree on some core principles, including that it's in our mutual interest to have a functioning system of government, right, that resolves disputes peacefully and democratically. And for there to be such a coalition, right, and for it to be in a position to uphold our democracy and push against authoritarianism, we need to protect civic space. So that means sort of space outside of the government in which individuals and organizations, business, faith groups, advocacy organizations, and other nonprofits can organize, can exchange ideas, and exert social and political influence. So protecting civic space Certainly means pushing back against abuses of power, like attempts to quash dissent. But it also means doing what we can to avoid something called anticipatory obedience. You heard that term? It's coined by a historian named Timothy Snyder. So anticipatory obedience happens when people begin sort of falling in line with the authoritarian movement even before they themselves are targeted. Right? So they take themselves off the field out of fear. That means that there are fewer people or organizations and a more narrow coalition of civil society that are left to stand up for democratic institutions and democratic ideals. And without that support, or without the pressure, as the case may be, institutions like the courts and the media are more likely to fail to do their job in checking abuses of power. That allows the sort of autocratic regime to further consolidate power, and so on in a vicious cycle. And it's worth noting, just as a bit of an aside, but because I'm here at the invitation of the Rappaport Center, that maintaining a pro-democracy coalition and protecting the civic space is going to require a lot of work by a lot of different parts of our society, but that importantly includes state and local government. So I know from my experience in the AG's office, and from my work now at Protect Democracy, that state and local governments will continue to be critical forces in the coming years. Hopefully forces for good, but not always. Sometimes the work of state attorneys general in particular, right, in keeping the federal government honest, is dismissed as politics. Sometimes that's true, but not always. I think in our federalist system of government, states actually serve as a really important bulwark against democratic decline. They can, of course, literally challenge abuses of power that violate the law. They can also do a lot to protect their communities and mitigate the harm that is suffered, and really promote and protect civil society in a variety of ways. And importantly, state and local leaders, who are really closest to the people, right, can play a really critical role in educating the public and in countering anti-democratic narratives and attempts to erode anti-democratic norms. So they can push back on the expansion of that Overton window that I mentioned, about how we view the presidency. But I can promise you, whatever happens in the coming months or years, and according to every scenario exercise or the like I participated in, state governments are absolutely critical actors. And they will be pivotal in the fight for our democracy. All right, so what if the nation chooses a different path in November? Is our democracy out of the woods? I'd say no. Preserving our democracy is about more than one election, just like the problems we're facing are about more than one person. I think the biggest mistake that we could make would be to breathe a sigh of relief and then just move on. Right? So for one thing, we have more than one democracy. We have 50 states and a number of territories in addition to the federal government. And while I said states can and should be bulwarks of democracy, too many of them now, I think, are instead serving as laboratories of authoritarianism. And also, just generally, if we've learned nothing else in the last 8 or more years, is that there are deep flaws in our operating system, right? So protecting and then hopefully one day actually improving our democracy is going to be a generational fight. All right, before I conclude, I want to say just a little bit about the legal profession in particular and where it fits in. The events of the last 8 years, I think, should be causing us to take a pretty hard look at ourselves. So on the one hand, there are ways in which lawyers have been absolute heroes. And we've seen some of the best of the profession. So I think back to example, January 2017, when there were lawyers in airports as soon as the travel ban was implemented. Or more recently, you may have read about a small legal aid organization in Texas that is defending a small Catholic charity against attacks by the state attorney general there. But in each of these examples, right, there were lawyers on the other side too. Lawyers, whether practicing or not, or just continuing to hold their degree, right, including some who are educated at our most elite institutions, have been behind some of the most anti-democratic strategies in campaigns in modern history, up to and including twisting the law to overturn the results of free and fair elections. So, what I'm not saying is that you have to work for a nonprofit called Protect Democracy, although I hope some of you might, or that you have to work for any nonprofit at all, right, in order to be part of protecting our democracy. I'm not saying that you can't zealously represent a range of clients with different politics or different viewpoints, but how we do our work really matters. It matters where we draw the line between advocacy and frivolous attempts to use the courts to achieve results, especially when those are anti-democratic in nature. Guarding that line, even just in everyday regular practice, is part of what helps to preserve the rule of law. I think all lawyers, whatever field they practice in, should feel a responsibility for upholding our democratic institutions. Again, irrespective of politics, irrespective of the clients we represent. In this moment we're in especially, it's just not acceptable, I don't think it really ever has been acceptable, to simply think of ourselves as cogs in the machine, right? Not responsible for the larger outcomes we contribute to. So as a profession, I think we can generally do better of grounding our work, not just in the specific rules of legal ethics, but also in basic concepts like the rule of law. And importantly, I think we can do a better job of holding each other accountable. So that means, in extreme cases, taking away law licenses from those who've done real harm. And to be sure, we're seeing some of that in the news very recently, but probably not enough. And it means not rewarding people who have engaged in or supported attacks on our democracy or otherwise undermined the rule of law with lucrative jobs or other perks. So I don't pretend to have all the answers here. I know this raises some really tricky questions, but I didn't want to conclude here today without saying that I think these are questions we really need to grapple with, both for the future of our profession and the good of the profession, but also for the good of the country. All right, in conclusion, both within and outside of the legal profession, the project of democracy is always going to be ongoing. Right? We cannot let ourselves off the hook. It requires that we sort of sustain ourselves, that we remain engaged, right? As professionals, as voters, as citizens. Authoritarianism is exhausting by design. Right? It thrives on fear and indifference, and so we cannot get tired and we cannot give up. I think democracy is worth it. I have the same quote here that Lizzie shared during her introduction about democracy and being sort of the best of the worst. I think that doesn't give it quite enough credit. Right? Democratic forms of government produce better outcomes than autocratic forms of government. Right? Among other things, democracies are more economically prosperous. They have people who are healthier and live longer lives. They deliver more public goods and services. They help create more equity among their people, and they experience less violent conflict. So I say we not give up on it. Whatever path the voters choose this fall, we have the ability, both individually and collectively, to shape a better future. I, for one, would not be making a career of democracy if I didn't think that was possible. Thank you.
Now it's your turn. Questions? Excuse me. And then you.
Hi, thank you so much for your time and speaking with us. You touched a little bit about how kind of protecting democracy will start at the state and the local levels.
Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more about what that tangibly looks like, especially for us as law students, and like what that might look like at the beginning of our career should we go into those areas?
Yeah. It can mean a lot of things. It certainly can, I touched on in particular state governments, right? So I worked at the Attorney General's office for a number of years. The Attorney General's office has been at the forefront of challenging some abuses of power at the federal level, right? So some of it's lawsuits. Some of the work that state governments do is in educating their citizens, making sure that schools know what the rules are so that students can come to school and be educated. Working with businesses so they know the rules. So I think that's a big piece of it. I think democracy is actually local in many respects. So we actually have a democracy here in Massachusetts that I'm sure there's many ways you can work in. So I would think of whether it's the state government itself or working in the nonprofit sector or anywhere else, thinking about the ways that states can be examples of democracy and also push back on further abuses that come from outside the state.
Thank you so much for your time today. One of the things I value most in your organization is that it strives to be bipartisan.
Yeah.
How do you go about making this issue of protecting democracy one that reaches across the aisle, and how do you have these conversations and sort of depolarize what has become a really, really polarized issue?
Really, really hard. And our politics, including our commitment to democracy, is pretty lopsided right now. I will say that I have found some of the most rewarding experiences in my career have been in this effort to work in a bipartisan way. So, when I was at the AG's office, I worked on equal pay legislation, which may sound like it's not bipartisan, but we built a bipartisan coalition and sort of passed unanimously at the end of the day. And that's because we really spend a lot of time talking and listening and being open to compromise and focusing on sort of core principles. Right? And then when I worked, a couple of years ago at Protect Democracy, worked on the Electoral Count Act reform. That was absolutely bipartisan. It would not have passed otherwise. You needed Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and you needed bipartisan organizations and others. In fact, Ben Ginsberg is going to be here right next week. I worked with him a bit. He played a key role in making sure that happened, right? And that was unique in some ways, right? It was a reaction to the events of January 6th in the 2020 election. But we were able to focus on common ground and things that across the ideological spectrum people agree on, like the role of states in deciding elections. Like nobody wants Congress deciding who the next president is, and some of the rules of the road, because it actually does serve in the best interest of everybody, regardless of your politics. So it's really hard. And within Protect Democracy, we have people with a range of views and a range of backgrounds. But again, we sort of focus on the issues where we do agree. And because that creates safe space to disagree on the other stuff.
Oh.
Hi, thanks for being here. I was wondering if you could speak to what extent does, I guess, maybe the professionalization of the role of politician and also incumbency protection in any way contribute to how people feel in relation to democracy? I think especially to your point about state government, I think one of the critiques we often have, especially as a supermajority Democratic system here, like Democratic meaning the party, is that the way we don't have same-day voter registration, unlike other states like New Hampshire, our incumbent, the way we redistrict favors Democratic incumbents, and so that can contribute to a lack of urgency for folks that often, I think, if you look at the ballot questions, many of them are the issues that the legislature couldn't act on, and so therefore it has come to the people. And so I guess my question is, to what extent does that type of system and that nature contribute to how people feel about democracy overall? And what's the fix, too? If people feel dissatisfaction with Congress because they feel Congress doesn't do anything, or their legislative leaders, is there any sort of fix besides just electing new people and putting all of your faith and all your eggs into like one imperfect politician?
All right, there's a lot packed into that question, but it's a really good question. And I have a group of colleagues who are focused on some of these like really big questions about our democracy. It's a team we have called the Democracy of Tomorrow. So yes, you can vote in new people. We can all do work to sort of shift where people are in terms of their own voting patterns. But we have pretty structural limitations in our democracy. So I think in order for our democracy to actually improve, not just sort of withstand the current moment, but improve, we're going to have to make some structural changes. And so that means things like making elections and the results more representative. Right? Massachusetts is relatively liberal. I think it's still skewed in terms of how we elect. Like, there should be more Republicans in the Massachusetts legislature than there are. And that has a lot to do, I'm going to get in over my head quickly in getting to this topic, but it has a lot to do with how we run elections. Whether we have open or closed primaries, whether we have proportional representation or not. So there are different forms of voting that we see other countries try. Ranked choice voting is a topic. There's more than one. There's a healthy debate happening. My organization focuses a lot on fusion voting. And so there are different options, but I think it's really important as we fight this battle that we also keep an eye on the future so that the options people have actually become better, right? So better in Congress, better at the presidential level.
Hi, thank you so much.
In terms of freedom of the press and the role that like polarization of the media plays in the authoritarian handbook, what role do you think that lawyers are going to take in the future of the media in terms of like authoritarianism?
One of my worst fears is that we're going to see a real crackdown on the press in a variety of ways. So, 6 years ago, 8 years ago, we saw some attempts at cracking down on the press. Removing press passes from the White House for reporters who gave unfavorable coverage, I guess. Or using, some of it's less sexy. It's using the sort of like internal regulatory powers of the government to disapprove mergers because they don't like, the president didn't like what the Washington Post was publishing. So I think there are going to be a lot of ways in which defending individual journalists and the press writ large are possible. I'd say in particular, I think, big media companies, I hope they're getting ready. I hope we don't see the sort of anticipatory obedience that I mentioned. But I think local journalists are really going to need as much support as possible. Already we're seeing, not enough local press and sort of local outlets closing down. And so the more you can do as lawyers or otherwise, I think to support those people will be really helpful. The Reporters Committee for the Free Press, I don't know if I have that name right, is one organization, for example, that has a hotline that journalists who are in trouble can call. So volunteer for an organization like that. That's one example.
Thank you so much. So you kind of touched on this on the previous question.
Yeah.
But to what extent do you think the structure of things like first past the post and single member districts are contributing into increasing autocracy?
So again, I'm not an expert in this, but I think they absolutely are. So I selfishly recommend. Some of my brilliant colleagues at Protect Democracy have issued reports on this. But when you have elections that are producing less representative results and that appeal to sort of the extremes of the base, you sort of lose, first of all, people in the middle. You lose the ability to compromise. And when you have those extremes, movements like authoritarianism are, I think, just easier to take hold because we're so polarized. In part, it's not just about elections, but it's in part because of that. So I actually think you can draw a sort of fairly straight line between the way we conduct elections and who we elect, and then what we're vulnerable to.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Bennett?
Yes, I do.
Go.
It's just a question of your terminology. You threw out a couple things and you didn't explain what they were. Maybe I'm one of the few people who doesn't know what they are. But twice, both at the beginning and the end, you referred to the Overton window, and I don't know what the Overton window is. And then you referred to fusion voting now, and I'm not sure what fusion voting is.
Fair enough.
I know rank voting, but not fusion voting.
So let's see if I can give the right definition. I don't know who Overton is. I probably should. But it's sort of the window of thought of what's acceptable and what is mainstream, and that can shift, right? There was a time where, I worked a lot on issues around securing marriage equality, right? There was a time where the country viewed that very differently, and then the window of public opinion and what was considered acceptable, even necessary, shifts over time. So that's what it's sort of the Overton window of what is sort of in the popular discourse and what people are accepting. What's the other one?
Fusion voting.
Okay. Fusion voting, as the best I understand it, is a system where you can vote for the same candidate under different sort of party names, right? So you can not only be a Democrat, but John Doe, who's a Democrat, John Doe might also appear under other parties. And so people have choices that aren't necessarily locked in just by their association with a party, and choose a candidate regardless. And both, I think, sort of a psychological effect and an availability on the ballot. Yeah. But read more about it by some of people smarter on it than me, for sure.
Other questions, comments?
So towards the beginning you mentioned, and I found this pretty interesting, that declining support for democracy, there's a generational component to it as well. And then, from Michigan. I graduated high school during the beginning of the Trump presidency. And I think there's also a very strong geographic component, not just in like a north-south divide, but you see some of these areas in the Rust Belt that have been, I mean, never really recovered from the recession. And I think that's definitely a factor in this. So I guess my question for you is, like, to what extent do you think kind of that deindustrialization component and also the generational divide contribute to declining support for democracy in the U.S.?
I think there's a lot that contributes to it. I mean, a lot of people say this in their own words. And so the Center for American Progress recently put out a report that has some really interesting data on some of the things that you're raising. But people just increasingly think that democracy isn't producing results for them, right, in the ways that they expect. And there are sort of a number of factors at play in why people feel different about our democracy and about our country, right? Just sort of changes in migration patterns, increased income inequality and things like that that people attribute in part to our form of government, as they should. So yes, I think sort of it does vary by state. The experience of living in our democracy, both economically and social, can be very different depending on where you live. And right now, just because of sort of demographic and other changes happening, social and economic changes happening, I think that's at least partly why younger people see democracy differently. We're also in a very different information environment than we've ever been in, like the internet. I say the internet like the internet's new, but the internet, social media, and the way we like share and verify information is very different. So I think there's a lot that goes into it.
Thanks for that uplifting.
Sorry.
Some years ago, the Koch brothers
Yeah.
Decided to put a lot of money into state elections, which goes to issues of campaign financing. And in terms of setting up congressional districts, they set them up in ways that were not necessarily responsive to democratic notions. Has your group ever done studies of how money affects things, or how the Koch brothers were very successful in creating different congressional districts because of the people who were elected in the state? What about the Supreme Court? There's so many whatabouts.
Yeah.
And campaign finance. I could go on.
Yeah.
Does your organization take a stand about those anti-democratic notions and try to promote them?
We don't really. And that's not because it's not important. So like issues of campaign finance or gerrymandering and the like are not issues that thus far we've focused on. That's in part because it's reasonably well covered by a range of organizations. I think about like the Campaign Legal Center, for example, who we work with a lot. You can find reports on those kinds of things. Certainly that's a component. I said we have a team that is focusing on longer-term democracy reform. Those kinds of things are a component of how they think about what the problems are and what the solutions are. But it hasn't been a sort of key focus of our organization so far. We've only been around for 8 or 9 years, actually.
One last question. Anyone have one last burning, fabulous question? Okay, well then I want to say thank you, Genevieve. You have given us so much to think about, to contemplate, provocative, little scary. You are all lawyers to be. Some of you are lawyers. There's a lot of work that can be done. We're going to be providing organizations that have studied and work on protecting democracy. We'll provide it to everybody. I hope you will come next week to hear a full, robust conversation with people from very different political perspectives. I also want to say, Genevieve mentioned marriage equality. We have just in the Rappaport Center secured Mary Bonato, who is the legal icon of same-sex marriage. She will be joining us on October 29th for a program, so you'll be hearing more about that. So we have a lot coming up and a lot is at stake. Whether democracy is truly at stake, let's hope not. Anyway, thank you, Genevieve. Thank you all. I hope this